Hi, I am Scott Barber. This is the Landscape Ontario podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Nadina Galle in Amsterdam. Nadina is an ecological engineer and technologist dedicated to working with urban ecologists and planners to apply today's technology to improve urban ecosystems for future generations. She is also the host of the Internet of Nature podcast, which you can find on all the major podcast apps. Nadina will also be speaking at LO Congress conference in January 2022. We hope you'll check that out. But first, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nadina Galle. So Nadina, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Scott. So I grew up not far from Landscape, Ontario, in Waterloo, Ontario, one of Canada's fast and growing areas. Very much a tech hub. It's attracted people from all over the world. Really, that's how my Dutch parents, ended up there for their jobs. I moved to Waterloo when I was 6 years old from the Netherlands. And growing up there in very typical suburban neighborhood, I witnessed suburban sprawl happening all around me at a pretty rapid pace. My parents used to live very much in the outskirts of Waterloo, which has now almost become the center, just because of all the development that's happened around it. And I think from a young age that stemmed a lot of questions that I had and fascinated me with, who gets to decide when, we lose an ecosystem and we get a human ecosystem or an urban ecosystem in the place for that. Who gets to make those decisions in terms of how we develop our cities? And eventually led to me being much more interested in, how could we perhaps develop cities that are both great for humans, but also great for all of the other species that we share our cities and our suburban areas with. Which led me to initially study ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Toronto. And I got the opportunity to do an exchange to Singapore, the National University of Singapore, which many have known specifically in the horticultural world as, Singapore touts itself as, a city in a garden. And it was an incredible opportunity to see, what a city that takes its urban ecology very seriously looked like. And that kind of really started the passion for me in terms of, how to, or I guess further the passion for me in terms of how to develop these sustainable, green, beautiful cities. I ended up moving from Toronto back to my Dutch roots to Amsterdam to pursue a master's in earth sciences, which then after a number of years of working as an urban ecologist turned into a PhD in ecological engineering, which I did at University College Dublin and at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT in near Boston. And that altogether, really the key focus of my PhD was to look at, not only what is the role of urban ecology, but specifically what is the role of up and coming smart city technologies within the field of urban ecology. I was, as I mentioned, already fascinated by urban ecology, but I felt like still nature seems to be very much under threat in our cities. And perhaps all of these new, tools and applications and digital technologies that were coming out through the smart city movement, I saw these being applied to waste management and mobility, even the way that we vote and we shop online. It seemed like everything was going digital and everything was going online. So why not take nature online? And that's how my concept, the Internet of Nature, came to be. And I've been working very hard to bring that under people's attention ever since.
Fantastic. And I'd like to get back to that in a second. But first, if it's okay, I'd love to maybe get a little deeper into what you said there with cities and urban areas. You talk about green spaces in cities. It's rapidly decaying or disappearing. Could you maybe go a little deeper into what you're seeing there, what we're seeing, I guess, in urban areas really around the world, including here in Ontario and Canada?
Yeah, I think when, we think of deforestation, we think of Borneo and we think of the Amazon, but we don't typically think of the urban forest, when in fact, we are losing trees and vegetation at a pretty rapid pace at our very doorstep. There was a study that came out in 2018 by the USDA Forest Service that showed that we were losing the equivalent of about 36 million trees every single year. That equates to about a 1% loss in urban forest cover every single year. And 1%, of course, doesn't sound like very much. But the crazy thing about that is that we were actually, that was paralleled by a 1% increase in impervious surface cover. So, asphalt and buildings and roads and these things. So we're developing at quite a rapid pace. And about 50% of all of this new development is actually taking place on land where we used to have trees or vegetation or some kind of natural ecosystem, which means that, we're not only losing trees, but we're losing land that we could potentially grow these trees and vegetation on. So if this continues, of course, we're heading into an era where we're losing more and more vegetation in our cities. And I don't think that we've even really fully grasped what that means, not just ecologically, but also economically. Trees and vegetation have a very large role to play in the economic health of our cities, as well as socially. Trees have such an important impact on the mental and physical well-being of people that live in cities and outside of them. So we're not only losing trees, but I think we don't even realize that we're losing them, because so much of these deforestation is actually happening on private lands, and private lands are very difficult for municipalities to enforce or to protect the vegetation that's on them. And even if they do have something like a private tree ordinance in place to protect this private vegetation, it is very difficult to enforce. And to give you an idea, about anywhere between 50 to 70% of the greenery of the trees that are in a city are typically on private land, meaning that the city only really has control over 30 to 50% of what goes on, which is a challenge, but I think at the same time a massive opportunity, because it means that we as individuals have a large role to play in preserving these really important spaces.
So I guess that's a good segue to, what from your perspective can be done about that, really alarming trend of, losing that green space, losing those trees and vegetation and green spaces. So what do you see as some of the solutions to this issue?
So I think anyone who's been in the urban forestry space, is no stranger to remote sensing, the use of aerial imagery, drones, and satellite imagery to be able to assess what the canopy cover looks like in a city. I think that's critical moving forward, especially because I think the most important thing we have to do first and foremost is better understand our urban ecosystems so that we can hopefully better protect them. And I think tools like remote sensing have a really important role to play in that. And we're now in a period of time where the resolution of the spatial resolution of satellite imagery that we have access to is so incredibly fine. I mean, we're talking about a 30 centimeter pixel resolution. That's the highest available resolution on the commercial market right now. And even at that high of a resolution, using this imagery is quite cost effective when you compare it to drones or aerial imagery that obviously you need to fly much more often and take a lot longer to be able to map the same area. Using the satellite imagery is able to not only give us an idea of where we've had trees and where perhaps we've lost them, but also we're able to look at the condition of trees, the health of trees, be able to even identify the species of trees. So for cities that still don't have an up-to-date tree inventory, this is a way to get that done a lot more cost effectively, and ultimately actually help us create more evidence-based decisions in terms of where we need to prioritize maintaining existing urban forest stock and perhaps planting new urban forest stock as well. And it could even play a role in helping us enforce deforestation on private land, which is a bit of a touchy subject, of course, because whose responsibility is that? But if a city has a private tree ordinance and that those trees of a certain size on private land are meant to be protected, we need the tools to be able to enforce that as well. So there's a whole host of different ways that we can use remote sensing to help us better understand the urban ecosystem. And once we've done that, I mean, there's so many different exciting technologies that we can use on the ground as well to help us better understand and hopefully better protect the urban forest.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, what about, and I think maybe you touched on a little bit of there, but could you give us a little bit of an overview of something you talk a lot about, and you mentioned it before, which is the Internet of Nature. Could you give listeners a little bit of a sense of what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so the Internet of Nature is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek to two different concepts that I hope to bring together. On the one hand, this idea that Earth has its own natural form of internet. For anyone that's read The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wollobin, I can highly recommend that as a great summer read. This idea that trees are not these solitary individuals that we thought they were. They're actually social beings that are in constant communication with each other via their underground fungal fibers. So I was always left with the question, if that's the case in natural forest ecosystems, what happens to those fungal networks when we plant trees and other vegetation in city? And it turns out that network is oftentimes disrupted in cities. And perhaps if it's disrupted, and we as humans, I think, need to take the responsibility to then take the best care that we can for that tree and for that vegetation. And perhaps technology is the tool that we need to be able to plug into that existing biological communication network. But the other flip side is, of course, Internet of Nature. Sounds a lot like the Internet of Things. Internet of Things is, of course, one of the most ubiquitous smart city technologies that we have. And throughout my research and examining all of these different smart city technologies, whether it be sensors or remote sensing, or surveillance cameras or machine learning or blockchain or big data, all of these different technologies and applications that we want to use to improve urban life, they've been used for all of these different mobility, waste management applications. But it seems that urban ecology has been long left behind from that digital revolution. So my goal is really, with the Internet of Nature, to take nature online and help us better understand and protect our urban ecosystems, better take care of them, but also reconnect people back to nature. Because I think that's what we need to do to really create this mindset shift that we need to make, that nature is a key determinant of our economic, social, and ecological well-being in our cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And from your perspective, what role do horticulture professionals, folks that, might be members of Landscape Ontario Horticultural Trade Association, the folks that are, designing, building, maintaining green spaces, that are growing, growing the trees and shrubs and plants, what role do they play in this thinking that you study and that you teach?
I think one of the most important roles, because they're the ones that are on the ground, that are shaping and creating, that they're shaping the future of what these ecosystems will look like. And I think traditionally, arboriculture and horticulture have been fields that have perhaps shied away from emerging technologies, maybe perhaps, and I know this is the case as an ecological engineer. I know definitely in ecology, ecology has been very technophobic in the past, because it feels like, how could a piece of technology possibly tell me what's going on in the field? I, as a true ecologist, need to be there and understand. But the fact of the matter is, with all of the pressing challenges that we're facing today, the urban landscape is far too complex for one horticulturist or one arborist or arboriculturist to be able to manage all of that. And we need to use whatever tools that we have at our disposal. And I see emerging technologies as a big one, to be able to better understand as the urban ecosystems, that we can drive more evidence-based decisions. So a very specific example of this might be the use of soil sensors. I think the number one thing that we see a lot of the time, as our summers increasingly get hotter and drier. We've seen already this past summer some insane heat domes and heat waves. Of course, they're a big threat to humans, but also to a lot of other species, including our trees. Trees can actually do quite well when it gets quite hot, but of course the limiting factor is water. And in a time of heat waves like that, and in a generally hot summer, it's very difficult to establish when and where and how much to water. Using Internet of Things soil moisture sensors to allow us to really drive evidence-based decisions on when, where, and how much to water. That's not just something that we can learn from, but it's something that we can act upon as well, and actually allow urban vegetation, even in these trying times, to thrive rather than just survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that example. Nadina, I really appreciate you giving I get that it's, just a really a brief overview of some of the topics that you're involved in, but I hope that it serves as a bit of an introduction and that listeners here, members of Landscape Ontario, other horticulture professionals in Canada, will seek you out. Where can they find more about what you do and more on these topics?
Yeah, I would definitely encourage anyone who's listening to connect with me on LinkedIn, which is just my name, Nadina Galle. I also have a website, nadinagalle.com. And this past year, kicked off the first season of my podcast, the Internet of Nature podcast. So for any of you that are interested in hearing more stories of different innovators and entrepreneurs using these technologies in the field of horticulture and arboriculture, I would definitely encourage you to check out. Season 2 is coming out in September.
Fantastic. Yeah, I hope everybody goes and checks out your website and the podcast. And yeah, it's great stuff. Well, thank you very much. Very much appreciate your time, and hope to talk to you again down the line.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.